Howdy folks, and welcome back. Hope you're all blessed and doing okay out there. Well, for today's video I present to you Locomotion 2, Taming the Iron Monster. And this program covers pretty much the beginning of the railroad's roots in England and how the trains got started before they spread throughout the world. It is very interesting and pretty darn cool actually. But before we get started, a disclaimer. I ain't paid, sponsored, or endorsed to do this. I'm not making any money off of it either. I am doing this for fun, preservation, historical, and entertainment purposes only. This program is out of print. All credits and rights go to the original creator and owner of this content. I own nothing except the DVD and the case it came in. Get it? Got it? Good. Alright y'all, all aboard for Locomotion, Taming the Iron Monster.
The blacksmiths, the coppersmiths, the greasers, the oilers. Then you had drivers, then you had firemen, then you had cleaners, then you had people that cleaned out the fire dropper, then you had the fellow that kindled the engines, then you had the tuber that tubed the engines, then you had the fitters that serviced the engines.
The story of the first locomotives and rail lines is one of heroic engineers venturing into unknown technology. Building the railways and making them work required painful trial and error. Railroads covered Britain at great speed, but progress came at a price. There were new demands placed on the environment and on people. There were industrial and economic struggles that created a new industry at home and set an example for the world.
I loved it. It was every schoolboy's dream to be on the mallard, coming down at 90 to 100 miles an hour. But the thing you had to do, and this only came by experience, was to judge speed. Now, even today, at the age of 80, I could tell a motor car's speed, looking at it, almost by just having a glance along the road. You had to do that because if you were coming to a station and you were stopping as a driver, you were stopping 200 or 300 yards before the station because there were all the people drinking coffee behind, people in sleeping cars, and you couldn't spill them out or spill the coffee. So you had to come from a high express speed of something like 80 to 90 miles an hour in about a mile and stop at the station, so, as we used to say, on a little Scotch threepenny bit at the end of the station. And you brought it in, whoop, just a little, whoop, where the cup went, oh, that's all right, we're stopped.
The railroads weren't always so precise. From the moment the locomotive was invented at the beginning of the 19th century, a struggle was underway to tame a new technology. It all started with coal, which by the 1800s had replaced wood as the primary fuel. Britain was the world's main supplier, but most of the coal mines in northeast England were landlocked. The lack of adequate transportation to ship the coal stood in the way of economic expansion. Where there were no canals, the coal had to be moved by horse-drawn wagons. Smooth rails and flanged wheels had been used for centuries, but the speed and strength of horsepower were very limited.
You had, at the beginning of the 19th century, something like 3,000 men, horses and carts carrying coal down to the States. And it would have continued, but we had a Napoleonic War, and the price of fodder went up to such an extent that it was very expensive to have one horse, one man and one cart.
In the coal regions, the pressure was on for some other source of power. And just as rails were already a fixture, so was the other essential ingredient needed for a railroad: steam. The earliest steam engines had been designed to pump water out of the mine shafts. They were huge and couldn't be moved, but the potential power was there.
In the north of England, power had been long produced from coal, and they learnt to apply that. Plentiful supplies of coal, plentiful supplies of iron and steel, and those were the ingredients of a locomotive. It was the adaptation of steam, this new form of motive power, self-contained, something that didn't need to have hay put into it or went sick. There was a piece of machinery there that men could coerce or force into working. In the winter months, it wasn't affected by the same problems. It could go through bad weather, it could go through good weather. The elements were there, and there were elements within the engine that provided this almost natural power.
The steam locomotive would transform the coal fields, and the man who got the credit became the first railroad hero. But in fact, George Stephenson did not invent the locomotive or the railway. Well before Stephenson, there had been experiments with wagons run on steam. But he did take the railways beyond the coal fields. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in 1825, an opening that was recreated here for its centennial. The railway was a national sensation. No one had anticipated the huge public response as 500 people climbed aboard. Stephenson's creation was acclaimed as the first public railway, and it was the beginning of a whole new industry.
His vision didn't just encompass the building of locomotives, and his articles to his apprentices said they got to learn everything from building bridges to learning how to scale over mountains to forming a thread upon a nut to building a platform. They had to do the whole concept of railway engineering.
Timothy Hackworth was the blacksmith on George Stephenson's railway. He is an unsung hero of early railway history. The very first locomotives had no brakes, and their boilers would often explode. Hackworth turned an ungainly contraption into a machine that actually worked.
He had to work on the first 4 Stephenson locomotives, which had come from the 4th Street Works at Newcastle. There were continual problems with them. In fact, the safety valve was held down until that time, which was quite frightening. And he introduced a spring so that the steam pressure would push it up. It was a very, very inexact science. There were no lathes, really, as we know them, so wheels had to be made in sections. Every part of it must have been an absolute nightmare to build.
In those early years, the railway pioneers failed more often than they succeeded.
Progress is very, very uneven. The first 4 locomotives on the Stockton-Darlington Railway were not terribly efficient. Hackworth asked to have the chance to build a locomotive to prove the supremacy of steam power over horses once and for all. And the great importance with this was that at that time, the directors of the Stockton and Darlington Railway might well have gone back to using horses altogether.
It illustrates this very rocky and unstable nature of development, that where a scenario works well in one place, it doesn't necessarily work well elsewhere. And they hadn't quite grasped the concept of what a locomotive could do and what it couldn't do.
George Stephenson's innovative spirit was passed on to his son, Robert. This is where Robert built one of the pioneering railways. The challenge was to take a railway into the hills, an undertaking more difficult than any that had come before.
George Stephenson, who was known as the father of railways, knew the laws of elementary surveying. He could look at the scenery and decide where his tracks would be laid. But George made no claim to be an intellectual, so he sent his son Robert to university, and when Robert came back, they worked together. However, old George, when he saw young Robert working with his theodolite, would quite often say, What are you digging with that piece of machinery, lad? Look at the ground. That will tell you where the rails have got to go.
Apparently, Robert's university training did not help. In the case of this one railway, he got things drastically wrong.
What they hadn't realised was that the different inclines that they were putting on these routes ranged from as steep as 1 in 3 in places. Terrain that motor cars of today would have great difficulty with. But they were working to the old philosophy that a horse would be there to pull the wagon on to its next stage. And of course they really hadn't progressed beyond the wagon-way mentality.
The Stephensons built railways to haul goods across the country, but they couldn't solve that one problem, getting a locomotive over the hills.
They couldn't get their goods to the consumer in time, and they were so ineffectual that great bottlenecks are springing up. By 1834, when the company had opened, it was already in financial trouble. By 1840, the whole thing had gone into bankruptcy.
It didn't take long to figure out that locomotives couldn't easily go up and down hills. There would have to be tunnels and someone to build them.
My great-great-great-grandfather came to this location before it was ever a tunnel, because he came here as a contractor back in the 1830s to work for the Sheffield, Ashton and Manchester Railway. It was a very difficult sort of terrain. It was hard rock, the conditions were poor. There was nothing to support any form of industry, and this is what this actually was. It was an industry that was developing here in the heart of the Pennines.
The railway companies borrowed from the methods of canal builders, known as navigators or navvies. By 1846, there were more than 200,000 railway navvies at work. Wherever tunnels or embankments were needed, the navvies were there to do the digging.
It's difficult for us to visualise the shanty towns, the navvy settlements of 2,000 men, women and children housed in quite squalid conditions at times, with frequent outbreaks of smallpox and cholera. I come from a family of Dales farmers, and like most Dales farmers, we've been there a long time, four centuries or more in my case, and every year we would get haymakers coming over, and they would be very similar to the navvies who worked on lines like the Settle Carlisle. Hard drinking, hard working, big men, often fighting, and on the farm, like on the railway, they did take a lot of keeping in order.
A few were skilled bricklayers and masons. The majority were unskilled farm workers, escaping from chronic unemployment in rural Scotland and Ireland. They came to the railways looking for work. They found the toughest work imaginable.
The daily routine of a navvy can best be summed up as one of unremitting toil. You might almost say unremitting hell in a lot of cases. They were equipped only with pickaxes, wheelbarrows and shovels, and that was about it. It's been said that only the earthworm has moved more soil than the railway navvy.
And then they came down here into this darkness, sort of troglodyte experience, working up to 16 hours a day in the most terrible conditions. Perhaps 15 or 16 men in a small confined space. Whatever they had to do, they would have to go off into a corner to do, because there was no going out of the works to find a convenience. There was sweats, the acrid air, hot, humid, dank, filthy conditions from morning till night, 16 hours a day. Occasionally they would be going through very, very hard rock, and suddenly they'd hit a patch of soft earth, almost like quicksand, and the whole lot would come in on them.
Workers willing to face such danger were paid well, at least by the standards of the time, but there were no laws, no regulations regarding safety, and there would be none for decades. The casualty rate resembled that of a war zone.
hundreds and hundreds of men actually died in the constructions of these subterranean passages, all to make this smooth road through the mountains to avoid the climbing over the hills and the heavy gradients that the trains of that day could not cope with.
Not since Roman times had there been projects of such grand scale, and the great tunnels were matched by a more visible achievement, the viaducts. To build these huge structures, railway engineers looked back to ancient architecture, to the Roman viaducts with their rounded arches. Dent Head is one of Britain's more famous viaducts. It's built from stone blocks, each weighing as much as 8 tons. It stands 100 feet high. To the architects and engineers, the viaducts were a sign of spectacular progress. To others, they were an abomination. Two miles up the track, the Ribblehead Viaduct is more than a quarter-mile long with 24 arches. The challenge for the designers was to span any and all natural obstacles in the path of the railways. The viaducts were based on antiquity. In other areas, railway engineers were beginning to innovate, and the most precocious innovator was I.K. Brunel. In his 20s, he designed bridges that were thought impossible.
Everyone said it would never hold up, that the span was too large to be made of brick. But it'll hold up for ages. You'll see.
I think the great thing about Maidenhead Bridge is that it proves how amazingly far-sighted he was. From an engineering point of view, it was a miracle anyway, because it is the longest, flattest brick arch in the world. And it was forecast by all the so-called experts of the day that it was going to fall down. And in actual fact, the contractor, when he took the scaffolding away from the center of one of the arches, it did shift slightly and something came away. And all these chaps laughed and said, ha ha, that bloody little Frenchman, he's got his comeuppance. He's not as clever as that after all. Brunel wasn't in the least bit phased because he knew that it was sound, structurally sound, and of course it has remained so. But the other thing about this bridge is he was building things for the future, not necessarily for the day. He built it obviously for the trains that he had, but he also built it to accommodate these monsters which roar over it every day. Heaven knows what speed, and with a colossal weight. And he's reputed to have said that it would take trains at 100 miles an hour. Of course, it was poo-pooed, but there we are. He worked like a lunatic. If he was engaged on a job, he would never stop. 24 hours a day was not unnatural for him. And there was a great story told of him that on his journeys back from the country where he was surveying the line, he would get back into his carriage late at night, he would pull out his cigar, because he smoked like a chimney stack, and he would go to sleep. And on his return to London, when they hauled him out of his carriage, the ash of his cigar would be laid down his waistcoat, absolutely untouched, absolutely down there.
The railway and the Industrial Revolution went hand in hand, each fueled the other. Railways needed raw materials from industry, and new methods of railway building were soon applied to other industries. Because of railways, the world's first major industrial center was created on the Tyne River.
Mechanics generate mechanics. Engineers generate engineers. People go on, they invent, they improve, they invent, they improve. Things get better. They move out of making steam engines, locomotives. They move into another industry. You can see it down the Tyne spreading. They go into making machines, steam engines to put inside ships. They build ships. The whole thing spreads.
It was always an exciting adventure to go to Newcastle from Tyndall. The highlight was the point where you crossed the bridge, the high level. If you were on the train and you saw the swing bridge and the big vessel coming underneath, you knew that there was a whole conglomeration of something happening. But uppermost of all was a little bit of fear that the train might stop or the bridge might collapse. and you would end up in the river below. You gripped your seat and you sometimes closed your eyes, particularly if you were in the middle of the bridge, because looking down, well, it looked like from here to eternity.
The railroad was invented to haul coal across Britain. Soon the railroad itself grew ever more dependent on the very product it was carrying.
The market takes off greater because now you're hauling massive amounts of coal, much more, 20 times as much coal as you did before. And the whole thing is being driven by a machine which is being fueled by the very stuff you're getting out of the ground.
Fueled by coal and railways, the Industrial Revolution began to transform the landscape and sky.
There were staiths where you saw the coal dropping down a special mechanism and into the holes on the ship. Now, when that happened, it didn't want to be in the vicinity, but that was where all the smoke and grime came from. And there was a whole pall of black dust and smoke over the River Tyne. And the ironworks were very, very busy. Each night, they opened the furnaces or the covers, but all at once, you would see this magnificent pink glow. It started quite pale, and as it continued, the glow deepened and the colour deepened. Everything was bathed in pink, the diffused light like rose, so that things that had been drab and stark and ugly suddenly took on a beauty.
The railway industry was a hotbed of competition, each line trying to outdo the other.
Bigger engines, better engines, faster engines, better carriages with lavatories that weren't known, and better stations and better facilities in the stations. The demand went on. Now that all meant work, didn't it? Over in Dundee, the foundries that made the parts for engines, the carriages that were built in Swindon and Doncaster, everybody was at work.
Behind the driver and the fireman were the blacksmiths, the coppersmiths, the greasers, the oilers, a whole army of men required to keep that engine rolling along and to keep the system operated. To bring it together of thousands of workers and all kinds of materials and designs. Nothing like this had ever been seen in the history of the world. Braking systems, air systems, steam systems, these were all completely new, and they originated, were developed, and came to flower in the British Isles, from whence they went to every part of the globe.
The railways employed more men than the entire British military, and they used the military as a model for setting up a hierarchy. Different jobs carried with them different status.
You had the gaffer, the boss. Then under the boss came all the supervisors, then you had drivers, then you had firemen, then you had cleaners, then you had people that cleaned out the fire dropper, then you had the fellow that kindled the engines, then you had the tuber that tubed the engines, then you had the fitters that serviced the engines. They were all there, all one family. And if you were working in a Taybridge locomotive, you were a Taybridge man, very loyal to the Taybridge fraternity, the wee family. But in Haymarket in Edinburgh, then there were Haymarket men. In Aberdeen, there were Ferryhill Aberdeen men. And everyone knew who you were. You were a Taybridge man, you were a Ferryhill man, you were a Haymarket man. But always there you were, standing with your chest out, and your little nipples standing out as well. I am a man from the Taybridge.
Railway companies promoted their corporate images by designing new stations.
The train shed, which was the innovative part of the station, was a mixture of iron and glass, and they were using in the train shed many of the materials that they were actually using to build the railways, and so you actually had an embodiment of the technology in the building. At the railway station, the public encountered technology head-on, in particular the engine. The Victorian age is the great age of steam, and you actually saw steam powering the engines. And this led to the creation and promotion of an idea of the romance of technology. It was actually something to see. There were sightseeing parties who were taken there and shown around
The station was the public face of the railway companies, its architecture designed to send the right signal to the passengers and potential investors.
There were several railway booms and busts in the mid-Victorian period. Fortunes were lost. Therefore, a revival-style frontage, a solid public building, could reassure investors that here was a solid undertaking they put their money into and it wouldn't be lost.
It worked. The railways grew by raising money in the stock market from middle-class investors who were eager to speculate in railroad shares. In the early years, there were more booms than busts, as lines spread across Britain, linking cities at astonishing speed.
The only big contrast between the early railway era and today is the incredible speed with which things happened. Because between 1830, when the Liverpool to Manchester Railway was opened, and 1852, when the line from London to York and Newcastle was opened, the basic framework of England's railways was designed, bills went through Parliament, and they were built in 22 years. It's the most astonishing feat in terms of organisation as much as anything else. And it shows how far society then was on the side of the railways to allow it to happen.
It seemed that nothing could stand in the way of the railways, not even a medieval castle. The optimism of the railroad barons verged on arrogance. Their power had no limits.
The railways were a completely unstoppable force. They went over, they went under, they went round. They actually had an idea to buy up the entire west end of London and create one gigantic railway station where lines from all over the country would come in a huge Union Station. Such was the power of the railway companies at that time, they could actually do anything that they wanted.
Gentlemen, it is a fact beyond disputing that the success of this railway must of necessity lead to the prosperity of this city, as well as to that of the entire nation.
Sitting in Parliament were over 100 MPs. They were called the railway interest, and nothing could stop those men. In fact, one of the railways inspectors said, "Who is running this country, the railways or Parliament?" And the people who represented the railways in Parliament said, "Well, we are. You just sit and talk. We have to go out and do the job, sir."
The opening of a new station in the golden age of British railroads, it was always a time for celebration.
Every time a railway was opened almost, you'd get a triumphal arch being erected and the local band would turn out and greet the train. And it wasn't until the 1870s, because of an economic recession of those times, and the 1880s in particular, you suddenly got the world beginning to question the way in which the railway almost had a divine right to take all before it. And then there seemed to be an awakening of the national consciousness that enough was enough.
This was the battleground, the scenic Lake District. Railway opponents were inspired by John Ruskin, who had witnessed another area ruined by a railroad and had written about it.
You enterprised a railway through the valley. You blasted its rocks away, heaped thousands of tons of shale into its lovely stream. The valley is gone, and the gods with it. And now every fool in Buxton can be in Bakewell in half an hour, and every fool in Bakewell in Buxton, which you think a lucrative process of exchange, you fools everywhere.
The Lake District had been made famous by the English poet William Wordsworth, another railway critic. Threats of a new line here were met with protest.
Ultimately, the opposition was led by Canon Rawnsley, who we now think of as the founder of the National Trust. At that time, he was the leading light in the Lake District Defence Society, which spearheaded the opposition to these railways, and out of that opposition, you can say, in some measure, grew the National Trust.
Canon Rawnsley was, at one and the same time, very sensitive to nature, to the environment, to the scenery, particularly of the Lake District, but also a very dynamic and energetic personality. He was born the year after Wordsworth died, and because of his admiration for the poet, he rather followed in his footsteps, I think, this romantic love of the very fragile beauty of this part of the world.
The Lake District is a very small corner of England, and yet in that small corner it has England's highest mountains, deepest lakes, arguably the most beautiful scenery. And by the late Victorian age, the Victorians had finally come to appreciate it for what it was. They'd ceased to regard it as a rather frightening, savage area, and had woken up to the superb scenery up there. And there was this movement in the 1880s to ensure that no more of that scenery should be desecrated by the all-encroaching iron monster.
Rawnsley was interested in preserving the peace and tranquility, and the greatest service which Rawnsley and the other railway objectors did for the Lake District is to preserve this beautiful Vale of Newlands where we are now from the threatened railway, which would have ruined the whole of the shoreline of Derwentwater. The Ennerdale Railway Bill was thrown out amid a great blaze of publicity, and Rawnsley overnight became the defender of the lakes, a knight in shining armour.
The battle between railways and countryside inspired the first conservation movement. There were new controversies to come, this time in the cities. This line ran right past a cathedral in London.
This environmental disaster area, with one of the busiest railway lines in the world, passing within about 100 yards, I suppose, of a medieval cathedral, was a sort of symbol of the final crash of the railways into the centre of London. Final because it caused the most appalling financial crash, the over-end gurney scandal, simply because of the cost of building a railway line into the City of London, into Cannon Street and Blackfriars, which caused a colossal overstrain on the railway companies involved and then on the banks that were backing them.
The expense of building railways in central London led to one of the great bank collapses in British history. Thousands of investors lost their life savings. Brokers had prospered by selling shares of railway stock, but when the main routes were finished, railroad promoters began to dream up more speculative lines with much greater risk for investors. When they devised a line running past an historic cathedral, the public rebelled.
So it's a symbol not only of the sort of furthest advance of the railways in terms of messing the environment about within London anywhere and within anywhere else really, any other major city, but it's also the final disastrous or Pyrrhic victory of the railways in that they ruined themselves in this so-called technological triumph which you're going to hear in the background.
If there was growing public skepticism toward the rail industry, it turned to anger after the first great railway tragedy, known forever as the Tay Bridge disaster.
Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay. Alas, I'm very sorry to say that 90 lives have been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. It was about 7 o'clock at night.
It was a very windy, blustery night. The wind was blowing so violently strong that the poor signalman had to crawl back into his signal box on all fours.
Then the train moved slowly onto the bridge of Tay until it was about midway.
And he watched the train climbing slowly up towards the high girders. And as he watched, sudden gust hit the side of the signal box and the structure swayed.
And down went the train and the passengers into the Tay. The storm fiended loudly bray because 90 lives had been taken away on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered.
The centre spans of the high girders had precipitated into the Firth, carrying the train and everybody on board with her.
Because none of the passengers were saved to tell the tale of how the disaster happened on the last Sabbath day of 1879, which will be remembered for a very long time. McGonagall was the worst rhymer of all the British poets, or all the Scottish poets. But McGonagall lived just about 100 or 150 yards from the end of the other side of the Tay Bridge, up near the bottom of Step Row. And he was sound asleep when the disaster happened. He never knew there was a disaster until the next morning. But that didn't stop old William Topaz McGonagall.
Sir Thomas Booch had designed the Tay Bridge and took responsibility for the disaster, but his plans had been approved by government inspectors.
There were a lot of contributory factors that the designer alone should not be blamed for. Things like bad casting, bad workmanship that was unknown to the designer, and of course all these things were hidden over. The holes in the castings were filled by putty, and a coat of paint was put on, and it really was the incredible optimism of that period. They thought that they'd almost got to a stage of infallibility. Nothing that they could do would go wrong, and unfortunately that night the wind and the elements proved that it could.
Right beside the stumps of the old Tay Bridge, engineers built a new one. Although it was much stronger, it had a similar design, so the builders added extra bulk to the legs. It performed no function, but gave the impression of added stability.
Railways engineering in the beginning was triumphalist. It conquered everything. But after the Tay Bridge disaster, which was a traumatic disaster for everybody, for the whole nation, the engineers, when they were designing the fourth bridge, had to adopt a belt and braces approach to make it ultra safe and look ultra safe and be ultra safe. But somehow they managed at the same time to transform it into a sort of symphony, a concerto of elegant iron and steel. And the combination was pretty miraculous.
The bridge across the River Forth was revolutionary for its advanced engineering. Originally, it was to be built by Sir Thomas Booch, but after his Tay Bridge crumbled, Booch was fired. The new designers erected a bridge nearly 2 miles long. Opened in 1890, it still stands as the queen of all British railway bridges.
Innovations always come in after serious accidents, very often with a loss of life. It happens everywhere, in mining, in railways, in engineering, always the same. And I always think that the best of the innovation, the roses of the innovation, the roses with the greatest scent, always have thorns attached to them. And if you make a mistake in picking up the rose, you prick your finger and you draw blood, as well as getting the scent of the rose. The tendency is, well, it's done well for 50 years, 60 years, we'll keep it. But then something happens and there's a loss of life and they say, sorry, we must do something about it. So disasters are usually the mother of innovation and progress.
After the Tay Bridge tragedy, railway companies had to consider safety for their passengers. But there was still plenty of danger for railway workers. Their daily grind consisted of long hours of physical labor in extreme conditions.
When I was a fireman, the cab was open, and the driver and the fireman, if he was sitting down, was stuck into the little front of the cab. But the wind came in both sides, and sometimes if you were sitting there, your back was freezing cold, but because the fire was just there, your front was absolutely roasting. So you had two parts of your body, but then the coal dried out, and then the wind would whip the coal dust all around, and the fireman had what they called a sprinkler. And if he wasn't too busy shuffling coal, he would sprinkle all around to keep the coal dust down. But there was that, and if it were raining, or even worse, snowing, then the rain would whip into the cab, and you had all lumps of coal dust, all wet, all flying around.
In 1891, Parliament heard testimony that some drivers were working up to 80 hours a week. Worse than that, that their shifts could last 36 hours in a single stretch.
In the last decade of Victorian England, the railways were little less than a slaughterhouse. In a period of 25 years, 13,000 men lost their lives working on the railways. We will never know the number of people who were injured in the same time. But that number of deaths is equal to 2 major sets of battlefields casualties. If you put a man on one of the famous Isambard Kingdom engines, a locomotive without a cab, and send him out to do a shift of 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 hours without food or without rest, it could only be expected that accidents would happen. And they did.
One British newspaper had this to say about railway workers.
They are, in fact, the director's scapegoats. And when it is impossible to deny that some great catastrophe has occurred, it is on their shoulders that the entire blame is laid.
The problem was that when a man was injured on the railway, he had no recompense. Someone had to have the blame. If the driver did not get the blame, it had to be his assistant. If his assistant could not be afforded the blame, it had to be an act of God. But who was never responsible was the employer. It was easy to see under these conditions how the early trade unions in the industry made safety on the line one of the most important planks in their programs.
In 1911, the first national railway strike brought British industry to a standstill. Within 48 hours, the bosses caved in and recognized the unions. 8 years later, a second strike turned violent.
This led Britain almost to the brink of civil war, a brutality which had never before been seen on the streets of this country, when working men put their heads at risk to the buttons of the police to say, we want safety on the railways, we want a proper deal for the first time in our lives, and we're prepared to face the bayonets and the truncheons of the army and the police.
The military was called in to stop the strike, but many soldiers sympathized with the rail workers. So did many other trade unions who joined the struggle. In the end, the striking workers won their historic battle for an 8-hour day. Within 1 year, the number of railway workers killed or injured was cut in half.
This had never been done anywhere in the world before, and this was obtained for workers throughout the world by the railmen of Britain who put their lives at stake in 2 gigantic strikes at the beginning of the 20th century. We owe them everything.
What's so astonishing when one looks at the railways and their impact is that one could be talking about the 1990s, not about the 1840s, because the agenda they set, the framework they set in place, is the one we've been operating within ever since.
That framework has set off the controversy now surrounding one of the great construction projects of modern times, the Channel Tunnel between England and France. There's a running debate about industry, the environment, and finance. For the first time since the creation of Britain's original rail network, capital is being supplied by private investors.
We have to draw on 150 years of experience in the creation of railways. And of course, we have rather lost the ability to do that, because essentially we haven't built a new mainline railway in Britain since the creation of the Great Central back at the turn of this century, rather than the one that we're going to build at the turn of the next century.
Today's engineers have inherited a rich tradition from British pioneers of the past. The work of Stephenson, Brunel, and others established practices that are still being followed.
What we do is, in fact, go right the way back to the very start of railways. The selection of the gauge at 4 foot 8.5, of course, came from a colliery in Northumberland, and it is still the same gauge, and it is the same in Britain as it is in France, as it is in Belgium and Germany. The track all the way to Paris will be left-hand running because the Stephensons were involved in the creation of railways in northern France.
The tunnel stretches for 31 miles. It is being dug using methods pioneered by I.K. Brunel and his father 150 years ago. So the basic technology of railways hasn't changed much. Neither have the controversies that surround them. To many in England, the Channel Tunnel and its builders are public enemy number one, just as railway barons were back in the 1800s.
It is almost exactly the same to talk to a consultation meeting today as it was back in the 1840s, when people were calling together public meetings, in fact, to protest against some of the proposals that were being made by the railway companies of the time. In fact, here there is a notice against the proposed Great Western Railway building through central London, and the noisiness, the proximity, and the disruption that is going to be caused by the railway. People had to come to terms with it then. We will have to come to terms with it now, and the meetings are exactly the same.
And something else is similar. New stations of glass and steel are being erected, built by the railways to bolster their image.
We have the Waterloo International Terminal. There will be a station at Ashford to receive international passengers. We will be creating similar pieces of infrastructure, possibly at St Pancras, possibly below the ground at King's Cross. They are extremely important pieces of infrastructure, and they need to make a statement about what the railway is all about.
A 120 years ago, the Dent Head Viaduct was a statement, built by pioneers and scorned by conservationists. Today, structures like this are themselves protected as monuments. They have become part of the British landscape.
All right, Shaw. Well, there you have it. Very interesting documentary. I hope you enjoyed that. Sorry about the background noise and the camera move there. I was trying to make a few adjustments. Yeah, this is being recorded right off my TV with my phone. Anyway, yeah, this really showed you how trains get started in the world, overseas in Europe, and from there it just expanded out westward. And the Tate Bridge disaster poem, there's a longer version of it online if you want to check it out. The first locomotive built in the world was actually built in England in 1804 by Richard Trevithick. The locomotive was called the Penny Darwin. You can find more about that online too. Sorry about the stirring, guys. I'm kind of tired. Anyway, until next time, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Please be safe around trains. And may the good Lord bless y'all. Happy rails. See y'all next time.